Hi folks, welcome to governance training for CRCs. My name's Andrew Huffer and I'm joined again by the most magnificent John Denton. So good to have you on board, John.
G'day Andrew, great to be here.
We're here in episode 10, moving on, where we bring it all together from all the episodes throughout the governance training program. And this is your opportunity to really bring together your governance plan to make sure that you're on track and focused and ready to make sure governance is the focus of all your operations in your CRC. So you can see we've covered a lot of ground today in each of the episodes, and today we're really just going to go through, I guess, some of the critical points of each one, so you really get a clear focus on where to take things forward from here, and that's why we've called it Moving On. Before we move on, let's have a quick recap of episode 9, where we talked about ethics. So we gave the real clear focus of that was about having a transparent decision-making process and making sure that was seen to be that way. We also talked in quite a bit of depth about managing conflict of interest. And we talked about some of the tools available to help you do that. We talked about some of the policies available and procedures that you should have in place. And importantly, we talked about the use of MSO to help you be able to grab them and adapt them and talk about them in your meetings of both your board and of your staff. So today, moving along, what we're going to focus on here is really to bring the core components of your plan together and make sure that you're really clear on where to take things forward from today. So we're going to do a bit of a recap of each episode, but more so looking at how to distill the key points and what you really need to have in place in your plan. John, I'm calling on your wonderful expertise to kick us off, to get us focused on purpose, thinking about where we should be going forward from here. Over to you, my friend.
Okay, thank you Andrew. Well, it all starts with, why are we here? I guess, and the board's purpose starts with what is the purpose of the CRC? What's the purpose of our organisation? What's our reason for being? So who are our stakeholders? Who do we provide services to? Why do we exist? So that's really the foundations, Andrew. And then we look at, what's the vision for the organisation and creating that vision and communicating that vision. We look at values and establishing the values for the organisation as well. So from the purpose and reason for being, we go to looking at documenting why we exist in the Constitution. And I know you're going to talk a little bit more about the Constitution, but in there are the objects, as they're called, which outlines why the organisation exists, what's the CRC's purpose. And then the board's role is really making sure that everyone is aligned and working towards that purpose, trying to achieve the vision and following the values of the organisation. And of course, there's a lot of governance and legal requirements, Andrew, that the board need to oversee as well. So why don't you take us through some of that? Absolutely.
So a bit about perhaps the responsibilities of the board and what you really should be focusing on right from the get-go. And this, if you recall, was in episode 2 when we had Lynn Levy from Wacos join us and take us through some of those legal responsibilities. And overall, is really getting a clear picture of acting with care and due diligence and making sure that all of your activities are about accountability. So let's just quickly go through some of the key points from that episode. You want to make sure that there's no conflict of interest. And anything that does come up along those lines, that there's a register for your conflicts, any perceived or real conflicts of interest. So that's all documented, as John referred to earlier, that having that paper trail makes it clear both for the board to follow and for anybody outside the organisation to be able to follow. So you're making quite clear right from the start that here are some of the issues that we may have that could bring us undone, and here's what we've done about it. The legal responsibilities are also making sure you're prepared. So you can't come up with that defensive, I didn't really know about that, wasn't quite sure about that. As a board member, it's about accountability and responsibility and making sure you put the time and effort into being sufficiently informed. And of course, on your board, it's really thinking about, I'm here to work for the CRC, and so all of your other interests have to be put aside. It's making sure that all decisions are made in favour of the CRC board, and this becomes a real challenge, I think, for small communities when you're involved in perhaps a number of other different committees. So that, I think, one of the challenges, John, is actually being able to put some of the other commitments aside to making sure you're really focused on what the CRC is there to achieve.
It's very easy when if you're in business or you're working for yourself, and then you get into positions where you've privy to some information which other people may not be, then it is tempting, I guess, for some people to make judgments more in their own interest rather than those of the CRC. So the legal requirements are, and the governance requires that all the interests are made in the best interest of the CRC, and that needs to be demonstrated as well.
And for me, like for example, I've seen in a lot of small country towns that have a tourism committee, or have the CRC board, and if you're on both of those, to me, again, it's making sure that I'm here today for the CRC board, not for the tourism committee, and making sure there's real distinction between the two. I also want to talk about thinking a bit further about your constitution, how that you can use that to direct you, to make sure you don't get caught up on some of these areas. The constitution, just as a brief recap, what it covers, it really talks about what you can and can't make decisions on. So those, what we call the power boundaries. We also talked about who can be a board member and who can't. So what are some of the criteria for being a member of the board and some of your responsibilities when you're there? And some of the dark side stuff, thinking about, well, if we do have a board member who's not fulfilling their responsibilities, that we actually have a procedure in place for not taking them out, that sounds a bit harsh, but for removing them. So that, again, it's a documented policy and procedure on the how-to stuff. And then, John, I know you're really big on policy with a procedure on how to make it happen. To me, this is a classic example of what needs to happen when perhaps things go wrong.
Absolutely right. And the great thing about having procedures and policies in place is that when situations come up, then everybody knows exactly how to deal with them, and also that there's consistency in dealing with them as well.
Absolutely. And the other point there is about meeting rules and procedures, making sure that you're following your constitution with your meeting rules, things like having the quorums in place, you're following at the right times, and that your voting procedures proceed accordingly. If you cast your mind back to episode 2, John came out with a lot of really good practical tips for your board members in terms of the constitution. So some of the things there were particularly in reviewing it and really making sure that you're focusing on what you should be working on. So it's similar to the areas when we talked about your power boundaries, to do maybe a quarterly review or perhaps an annual review, John, where you think about, is there anything that we are doing now that we actually shouldn't be doing, that's outside the Constitution? Or is there anything that we're doing that the Constitution says we can't do? I'm really interested in your thoughts on that one, just to help make it clear for people.
Yes, Andrew, it's very important to review the Constitution on a regular basis. I've seen situations where constitutions have become out of date or the organisation's moved on, and then in some cases they can actually not be doing what they're supposed to be doing, but even getting outside of the law as well. So it's very important that review takes place, and I always recommend that the board make up a summary of the Constitution, and that's used in the induction process for new board members, and that every board member has that, so that when you're having meetings and when you're making decisions, people can quickly refer to the rules if they've forgotten. So it's important to do a regular review. It's important to make sure that you're doing what you say you do in the Constitution and that you're operating inside the law.
And I really like your point on that summary document. I think that quick reference one makes it so much easier rather than having to go through the reams and reams of what's in your Constitution, of the critical points when you talked about the objects, the membership rules, and perhaps some of those decision-making rules. To me, that's going to be a fantastic document, which should be pretty easy to put together. That takes us to having a really strategic approach to the business of your board. And John, I'm interested in just having, I guess, some insights from you on what you see as being a strategic approach to board operation versus an operational approach. Could you just give us some insights onto that, please?
Sure. It's very easy, Andrew, for boards to get caught up in the day-to-day operations and the everyday running of the CRC or the not-for-profit organisation, when really the board's role is there to be strategic and, as I said before, to have the vision and purpose in mind and to be making sure that all the activities of the board and the CRC are working towards that vision. So what we talked about in this episode was about thinking about the now. So the now is, where are we now? What's the reality? What are the facts? And getting that very, very clear. Before you can set a vision and a goal to move on, you really need to know where you're starting from. And then the where is the vision of where you want to get to. And look 3 or 5 years down the track as much as you can. And I know things will change, and the plan has got to be a living plan. But start with the end in mind. So start 3 or 5 years down the track and then work back towards what you need to be doing today to make sure you're heading down that track. And then think about the how. So if that's where we want to get to, how are we going to get there? What do we need to be doing and actioning now on a daily, monthly basis, and having a plan for that? Any thoughts on that, Andrew?
Absolutely. One thing we've used quite a bit with a lot of groups, with CRCs and other not-for-profits is, and also with farmers, interestingly enough, is get them to think about that. Where do they want to be in 5 years' time? And actually get them to draw it, to get it just a big bit of butcher's paper or flip chart or up on the whiteboard in the CRC boardroom, and draw out who's going to be there, what are they going to be doing, what are you going to see there, what will have changed. So it's really getting people focused on that future picture. So it's literally a picture of who's going to be around, what they're going to be doing, what's changed. So that just really helps, I guess, make it sharp for people.
Yeah, it's all about planning, and the 7 Ps I think we've mentioned a few times, Andrew. Prior preparation and planning prevents pretty poor performance. So, and again, I come back to the point is that the board should be spending most of its time being strategic and not handling the day-to-day operations of the business. So in meetings, in everything that the board does, think strategy. Are we working towards the longer term goal? The next episode we went on to after that was about policies and procedures. And Andrew, we had some really good discussion about what's the difference between a policy and a procedure and what sort of things they should cover. For me, a policy is saying what you're going to do, and a procedure then documents how you actually do that. So, and the reason this is important again is because it's getting everybody on the same page, everybody understanding what the policies are, but then putting the procedures behind the policies so that people know all the time exactly how to behave and what procedure to go through to make things happen, and keeping it as strategic as possible. And once you've got the policies and procedures in place, of course, it's no good unless everybody knows what they are and working to them as well. So again, document a register of the policies, and I always suggest that you document it in terms of the ones that we must have. These are the mandatory ones, and then some secondary ones that it would be great to have these, and then some of the others can come last, because it can be seem quite an onerous task to create all these policies and procedures. So if you start with the most important ones first and then work through the list. And of course we've talked about MSO a number of times, Andrew, and there are lots of good policies and procedure templates and instruction on how to develop them.
It's your friend in a time of need, there's no doubt about that. The other point I think we should bring up about the policies and procedures when you talked about ensuring awareness was Lynn Levy's idea of having, talk about one of them at each of your meetings. So perhaps once at every board meeting you talk about one policy, then the following board meeting you talk about the next policy and procedure. So that way they're kept current all the time rather than something we refer to in case of emergency type of situation. And I'd recommend doing those in staff meetings as well.
Absolutely, it's an ongoing process like a lot of these things, and it keeps it front of mind as well, the fact that you are reviewing them. So that was policies and procedures, and then we went on to a fairly detailed episode on financial management. I find on a lot of boards that the numbers get presented by the treasurer or the finance subcommittee, and people look at the numbers but they don't really know how to interpret them or what they mean. And we had some really good input from Charles Sondergaard from Sondergaard Accountants on this episode, where Charles explained about some of the things to look for in the numbers. So again, I recommend you get the Treasurer to set up a subcommittee for finance and actually not just put the numbers together in a report, but actually put some bullet points and some information there as to how to interpret them and what it means. And again, it's all about trying to stay strategic. And Charles made the point that, you know, the numbers need to be telling you what's going to happen in the future. So use forecasting, use budgeting, so that you don't hit any too late situations. You know, historical numbers are great, tells you what's happened, but what you really want to know is what the future holds. And of course, as a board, it's all about being accountable and making decisions based on those numbers.
Absolutely, and that to me is one of the real standouts from that episode was when you just mentioned that, tell me what the numbers are telling me, but also tell me what I need to know coming up in the next 3 months. It doesn't really matter what happened the previous 3 months if I can't use that to anticipate what's going to happen, and if I can't use that as a tool to react and respond to that and make those changes accordingly.
Exactly. And if you don't have good numbers and you don't have them presented the right way, then you can't make such good decisions.
I think you're opening yourself up to things just happening at random and you're not really back in control of where the organisation's going and travelling. And especially nowadays with any organisation that's looking for external funding, being right on top of your numbers is just so critical for you to have as much control over that as possible. It's just going to become more and more important over the next couple of years, in my humble opinion.
Charles's point about budgeting, and again, where you're reliant on just a few sources of income maybe, and they can be a no-go type situation, because if you lose one of those sources of income, then you can be in real strife. So you need to be making good strategic plans and decisions based on the numbers that the accounts are telling you. And again, it helps you to prioritise and stay focused on the most important things. Andrew, I know that's one of your topics.
And that's a really good intro, John, into the next episode, where we're joined by Lisa Fisher, who's chair of the Meriden CRC. And we had a really strong focus there on what we called high payoff activities, our HPAs. We talked there about how they give you really clear focus on why you're on a board and what you're there to try and achieve. So just again, to take us back to that definition of a HPA, it's making sure you're quite clear on the reason you're on the board and what skills they need from you and what you're actually there to make a difference for. So it's actually, I guess, putting up a little bit of a pedestal because the board needs you to do this task and do it well. So to me, getting a really clear understanding of the value you bring to a board is critical to making sure you actually have an active role there and help that board achieve its purpose that John mentioned right at the start of the program. We also talked about meeting structures and planning, and that first acronym of POP, the purpose, outcome and process. So to make sure you're getting maximum value from your meetings by being really clear on what the purpose of each meeting is, what outcomes you want to see it delivered, and then start to think about how we're going to make sure we get people's inputs into that process. We talked about the importance of scheduling your meetings, and we had some great ideas, I thought, John, that take us away from the normal 7 to 8 o'clock in the night type meetings that I reckon drive people into the ground because you're tired, it's the end of the day. I don't think you're getting maximum value from that. So we had some really good ideas both from Lisa and from Gordon Marwick when he was on the program about the different timings of meetings. Your thoughts on that?
I particularly like the idea of having breakfast or dinner at the meetings. That's something that I've not been involved in many boards that do that. But I think it makes sense where people are very time poor, that you schedule the meetings. You schedule them well in advance. So you probably have a 12-month or longer schedule of when the meetings are going to occur. Try to keep them on a consistent basis, and then people can plan around them. But I particularly like the idea of incorporating a breakfast or a lunch or dinner as well, because that, again, makes the meeting that little bit more attractive and gets people to come along.
Absolutely. And You know, we've talked a bit about succession planning throughout the program. We'll come up to that later. But if you're running a board that's wanting to get working people involved, then this issue of timing is really critical. It's no point having night meetings when if you've got younger people with kids to look after or have still got business to run during the day. So to me, it's really thinking about what's the time that's going to be useful to current board members, but also to future board members.
Absolutely. We're talking volunteers here. So, you know, we need to make it attractive and interesting for them to come along. They generally want to be there because they're passionate about the organisation, they're passionate about giving back and contributing, so let's give them something back in return.
And they're probably passionate too, I think, in wanting to be part of a interesting, exciting team that's actually going to achieve something. And we went on to this in episode 6 when again we were lucky to be joined by Lisa Fisher from the Meriden CRC when we talked about team development. And some of the key areas there that we're focusing on is thinking about the potential that people can offer rather than thinking about the things that they're doing wrong. So, and that's one of your big mantras, John, in coaching people versus trying to manage people all the time. It's really coaching for their potential. And your AFL experience as a coach, I think, would come in pretty handy in all this.
Yeah, it's not that I've coached any AFL teams officially.
Yes.
I coach them from the armchair or from the stands. But
Indeed.
But it's all about coaching people for performance and believing that they have more potential than they're currently exhibiting, rather than just managing them on the results that they've achieved so far. But look at how we can improve the performance of the whole team by improving the individuals and working with them.
And that's a really good point, I think, that, you know, how can we make the whole team move forward by people understanding their role and how they're going to contribute to the success of the team. And we also talked about having, I guess, clarity for people, both for staff and for board members, and having goals that they want to achieve in their time there, and then having some work plans in place to help achieve that. So to me, I think it comes back to that mantra of plan quarterly, review weekly, act daily. I think for things like goals and work plans, that mantra works really well.
And again, if you've got goals, it's like sporting teams, you know, everybody on the team, hopefully, knows what the goal is. In AFL, it's to get the ball between those big sticks, you know, and it's getting people focused on what the goal is actually about. And once people know what the goal is, then it's much more motivating for them to achieve it. So by setting goals for them, board members and staff, and then developing the plans to achieve those goals and working through them, that's what that episode was really all about. That was the essence of the episode.
And I think it's really important to recognise those goals and celebrate them when you achieve them, because I think that's something we probably miss a bit too much in both business and not-for-profits and in boards. We assume, oh, yep, that's great, we've done that bit, let's move on. I think it can be a lot more time and effort put into marking that, and so people can see that there is real value that you're delivering as well.
I'm all for celebrating.
Absolutely.
But catch people doing something right and tell them. You know, very often we're quick to give negative feedback or pick people up when they're doing something wrong. But the really motivating thing to do is to catch people doing something right and tell them and thank them.
It's simple things that pay off in spades, big time. We also talked about the recruitment process in recruiting staff and the critical points that we need to focus on in doing that. And to me, it's all about consistency, making sure we have clear selection criteria that match the needs of the role, having a selection panel that can ask good questions and have an understanding of the position. And it's probably worthwhile, if you're recruiting for a staff position, to have a person on the panel who will be supervising the staff member, so they have that understanding of the role. And we also talked a bit about what are some of the things we need to think about in the actual interview techniques, making sure we ask consistent questions in the same order each time through to all the candidates, because the critical thing in this recruitment process is making sure it stands up each time.
Absolutely, and just having a procedure, again, then so you go through a consistent process every time, and it stands up to scrutiny. So as we talked about in some of the other episodes, quite often because of the small communities involved, CRCs end up employing friends or relatives into positions on the board or as staff members, and it's very important that if anybody questions some of those decisions as being a conflict of interest or something like that, that you can show that you've been through due process and followed the procedure. It's got to be open and transparent.
You betcha. The other thing we talked about was some tips for people who are interviewing candidates. And one of the ideas that was floated and we think works really well is in getting the candidate to provide an example of when they've had to deal with perhaps a challenging situation, or an example of when they've had to show leadership in a team, or an example of when they've had to provide good customer service. And these are all often, you'll see, selection criteria for many of the positions within a CRC, looking at either or coordinators or trainees. So a good way to really get an understanding of how well this person can perform is relating it back to their own reality and being able to get practical examples of when they've dealt with a similar situation in the past. We also talked about the importance of referee checks and following up once the interview process is completed and if you've chosen your preferred candidate. And one of my favourite questions for asking a referee is ask the question, can you give me some tips on how you would manage this person? And I think that starts to really unfold some of the things that they may not be so strong on, or some of the things may be a challenging thing you need to be aware of in the future. So that can just help you make some final decisions, in my view.
I think that's a great question, Andrew. It's not one that I'd used up until now, and since you mentioned it, then it's on the list. And the other thing, again, past performance is a good predictor of future behaviour. So following up on those referees and checking out what's happened in the past is absolutely critical. And I'm absolutely amazed at the number of people, both in business and not-for-profits, who don't do those referee checks. So that's another key thing that people can do quite simply.
Absolutely. And just to tie this out, the other areas we need to be really clear on is the follow-up process and making sure the whole process is documented, and you give good feedback to the candidates who didn't get the job. And good feedback can be along the lines of the things we thought you did well, what made you suitable to the position, and here are the reasons why we employed somebody else. And here are some areas to work on in the future. So people are really clear that the process, again, was consistent, and if they wanted to get to this position in the future, here's perhaps some areas to work on from here. You just mentioned performance there, John. I think it's worthwhile talking about the episode where we talked about the performance on the board when we had Gordon Barwick from York CRC join us.
We did indeed. We had some great input from Gordon, because again, the thing about the board is that you need to get a good cross-section of skills based upon what it is that you're trying to achieve. So having got your purpose and your reason for being clear and all your plans laid down, now have a look at the skills that you need to actually implement those plans. And in the episode, we talked about setting up a skills matrix. So having a look at the different roles on the board, the different things that are coming up, and the kind of skills and experience that you need to achieve those sort of things and get the best match that you possibly can. And of course, we all understand that in some of these small communities, the pool of people that you're drawing from on is not going to be that large. But at least if you've gone through the skills matrix process and you know where the gaps are, then you can do some planning to train people up or to seek out other people to come in and fill the gaps. I mean, this is true as much in business as it is in not-for-profits, isn't it, Andrew?
Absolutely. And I'll just go back to my favourite, I guess, leadership example is a guy called Shackleton, who is an Antarctic explorer who found himself stuck in the ice down there for a couple of years. And one of the great things that he did well was that he was quite clear on what his strengths were as a leader, but equally important, he's really clear on what his weaknesses were. So the people he recruited were the people who could match and fill the gap of his weaknesses. So he made sure he had a balanced team around him that could really help them achieve their objectives.
And this episode was all about board performance and how well the board performs and measuring that as well. We had some really good discussion with Gordon about what qualities make a good chairperson, because like any team, you need a good leader. I always say that a good leader has his eyes on the horizon. It's not always the easiest thing to say. Has his eyes on the horizon, but his hand on the tiller. So he knows where the future is, he knows the vision and where he's trying to get to, but he also has a hand on the operations and making sure that the ship stays on track. And of course, any leader needs to be inspiring because he's got a team on the board, he's got staff as well, and it's about inspiring them and keeping them motivated and achieved and working towards the vision.
I like the way, John, in that episode, how you pointed out being inspiring really means you set the tone for how this organisation should run. You set the tone for how even this board meeting should run. You set the tone for how you like to see staff working together. So to me, I thought that was a really good, simple example of if you come in a sort of down and out, grumpy mood, that's the way everyone's going to operate and behave around you. But if you come positive, looking towards the future and thinking about what can happen, then people lift to that level as well.
That's absolutely right. You know, as a leader, you can't afford to have a bad hair day, which is why Andrew and I don't have any hair, because then we can't have a bad hair day. So it's also about being efficient, because again, we're talking volunteers, we're talking people who are quite often time poor. So it's about getting the most important things done in the best possible way, making good decisions in a timely manner, making sure that people follow up on the decisions and that the actions get carried out. And yeah, there's lots of room for distraction there, but staying focused and on track as well. And of course you need a competent chairperson, so someone with the skills and the competence and possibly the experience of being on a board as well. Any thoughts on either of those, Andrew?
Yeah, well, it was interesting when Gordon joined us that he was actually, I guess, almost headhunted to be on the as chair of his CRC because of his experience as a Shire president. So I think it's really, and that really starts to bring us into the area of succession planning, where we've got a whole new program coming up on that, for people to be thinking about, well, what are the qualities of the people we want as part of this board? And at York, they were smart enough to seek out somebody who had a wealth of experience in leading a team, but understood what was required to do that within a local community. So I thought that was a really good choice.
Absolutely. So it's about building the team, and a good leader will build a team.
And
sorry, Andrew, go on.
On that building the team, I think it's really important that people coming into as board members can see opportunities for themselves. So a bit of that, what's in it for me. So they can see that from the time they come onto the board to the time they leave, they're going to build some really useful skills. And I remember Lisa Fisher from Meriden saying that she's got lots of value from being chair of their CRC and has been able to transfer some of those skills into her business, which is really taking that business forward as well. So to me, I don't think we should hide those sort of things. I think they're really valuable things that we should be putting out there as a CRC to say, come onto this board. Not only will you really enjoy your time, but you're going to get excellent value for yourself and develop yourself as a professional and a person.
Absolutely. Well, a lot of us forget that it's actually part of our development and growing our experience as well.
For sure.
So, and one of the things we went on to talk about after that, and I think you're going to cover some of this, Andrew, was confidentiality. Again, in a small community where everybody knows everybody else, it seems, then you've got to be very, very careful on how you handle information and privacy issues.
Like you said, John, in a small community, I reckon this is amplified probably 400% at a bare minimum from the data I've gathered. In confidentiality, we talked about the three critical areas is being managing information availability. So making sure we're really clear on who has access to what information within the CRC and almost creating, I guess, hierarchy of permission. So perhaps at the most sensitive level of information, it's the coordinator and the chair who are the people who have access to this level of information. And in terms of that, we also went through, I guess, some of the examples of information that can be disclosed and can't be disclosed, and to have some policies and procedures in place to help you with that. One of the examples we used was the Rural InReach program, which a lot of CRCs provide a service for through their video conferencing. And so there's some pretty sensitive stuff that's being talked about through that. It's essentially a counselling service. So that I guess puts employees in a very responsible situation, because it's none of their business why people are coming in to use those services. All they need to know is there's somebody coming in that needs to use this service. I need to make sure it's operational for them. So to me, services like that really put staff in quite a high level of responsibility in terms of information management and how they use it. And I think we've got to be really clear through the policies and procedures side of things on how that's done. John, you're the IT guru. I won't say the word geek here at all. That'd be inappropriate. Interested in your insights in terms of things like using passwords and codes for information access and making sure that you have a robust information network within your CRC.
Yes, Andrew, it's and I much prefer guru to geek, thank you. The IT these days, you hear a lot of horror stories about people breaking into people's networks and stealing information and things like that. So it's very, very important that the CRC has a good IT person who can recommend and install good security systems. You need good firewalls to prevent people hacking in to the network, and obviously be careful about spam and things that are coming across the email as well, and what you open up. So get some good advice from your local IT people. The other thing is that, of course, you've got to keep passwords confidential as well and determine who can have access to certain services. For example, banking is a key one. You know, the CRC needs to have a policy as to who can access bank accounts, and most banks these days offer different levels of access. So typically you can get someone to set up the admin side of it and set up payments and so on, and then it takes 2 or 3 board members to, in conjunction with the coordinator, to then authorise them and actually make that payment happen. So you've got some cross checks.
Yep. And the thing that stood out to me from that episode as well was, don't leave this all with one person. The number one is your enemy.
One in business is the most dangerous number of all. So again, keep a register somewhere, or keep some way of tracking passwords that people use to get into the system. The last thing you want is for someone to be sick or not to turn up, and then people can't get access to services on the system or on the internet. And I mean, that just comes down to basic things like getting into the building and things. It may sound obvious, but I've seen situations where executive officers or coordinators have gone on leave or gone sick, and then no one can get in the front door even. So make sure that you've got cover, make sure things are documented, make sure you've got a register of keys and they're stored somewhere that everybody can get to them. But again, limit the access to the people who need them.
Absolutely. Our penultimate episode, that being our second last, was talking about ethics when we were rejoined again by Lynn Levy. Talk to us, John, about some of the critical aspects that we covered through there in ethics, please.
Sure, Andrew, and I guess this follows on from the privacy and confidentiality episode and discussion that we had as well, in that ethics is all about how you say you're going to behave. It's all about your values. It's all about the organisation's values and how the organisation is going to behave. And then your conduct should then match your ethics or what you say. So it's definitely about being transparent and open and living by what you say you're going to do. Yeah, so a lot of the things that can come up, just simple things like being honest and open with people and telling people, you know, how it is. Conflict of interest, of course, is a big one, again, in small communities, and we've talked about that a fair bit. But, you know, we talked in the episode quite a lot about how you manage that conflict of interest as well. So what are your procedures to ensure that people who have a conflict of interest disclose them, but then having disclosed them, then don't take any more part in the decision-making process? Because it's one thing to say there's a conflict of interest, but then it's another thing to do something about it. That was a critical part of that episode.
The other thing that stood out to me from that episode, John, was the being quite clear on ethics and conduct. And ethics is talking about how we do things around here, and this is how we agree we're going to operate. And conduct was really about the practical side of it. So whether conduct is coming to meetings being prepared, being punctual, being professional in the way you provide your services, either as a board member or as a staff member. So getting quite clear on the on the relationship between ethics and conduct.
Yes, ethics is about doing the right thing, and that's the right thing by everybody, all the stakeholders, but also being seen to be doing the right thing. So making sure that you document things, that you follow procedures and policies, and that you've documented all that and that there's a track record. So it was a very big episode, that one.
Yeah, and I think it's well worth people revisiting that and possibly as many of the episodes as they can, and going and using resources like MSO. It's a fantastic resource which has lots of practical tools they can readily adapt. It's a fantastic service, costs nothing, it's there for you. I'm all for it. So we've covered a lot in these 10 episodes, and from here we'd really encourage you to go back and discuss the program with your colleagues, review them. If you're still a bit unsure, or if you want a bit of reinforcement, is to review some of those episodes. Use the workbook. It's quite a detailed tool for you to utilise. So go back through and look at the in-depth examples just to help you make sure you're really on track with your governance plan. And the important part of this, of course, is to go forth and implement. Don't just plan, just do something with this and make sure that you're really following this and using this as a practical tool to help the direction of your CRC and achieve what you want to achieve from here. So thanks, John. It's been wonderful having you on board throughout the 10 episodes of the program and being joined by our guests. I think it's been a lot of value that's been provided, and I've certainly learnt a lot from you and having you on board, so thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. It's been a very interesting journey, and I think we've all learnt from it, and hopefully the viewers will get a lot out of it as well and now go away and take action, because nothing happens until there's action.
Absolutely. And I'd like to say a thanks to all our presenters that came along throughout the program. Thanks to the most magnificent Ros Worth from the Department of Regional Development for making this all happening. And for our fantastic technical crew here at Westlink, to Steve and Bob, who have been here by our side and pretty much making us look good the whole time. So thanks, folks, and we hope you get real value from reviewing the program from here on. Bye now.